Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we're going to review the old garden here in a three-part series reviewing the vegetable gardens here on the homestead. Let's get going. Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is the first of a three-part series where we're going to review the primary vegetable producing gardens here on the homestead. Now keep in mind, last year was the first year that we had these gardens, so we made quite a bit of mistakes. So the way we'll be reviewing these beds is we're going to start off with the mistakes that we made, and then we're going to kind of go into our wins, and we'll follow it up with what we learned to sort of help us going into 2023. So the top garden was not completed, and by completed what I mean is having the compost in the beds in a moment to settle as early as we would like. We didn't get that task completed until the middle of January. I don't really have any excuses for that. That's just the way that it worked out. The reason I bring that up as our first mistake of the year is traditionally we like to leave 10 to 12 weeks from the time we put the compost in, fresh compost, until we plant it. That just allows the nitrogen levels to sort of cool off a little bit so that you're not stunting the growth of any of your plants or any of your roots or anything. So if I had to start with a mistake, I would say right there at the very beginning, not allowing enough time for our compost to cool off before we started planting. Another mistake we made that had an adverse effect overall on the output of the old garden here is we did not put up any protection from our chickens. As you'll see in some of the later videos here, our top garden and our pallet garden are both protected from the chickens. Again, we kind of just started the homestead, and we had gardens before, and our experience was that the chickens didn't bother a lot of the things in the garden, and so we put those here in the old garden so that we didn't have to put any sort of wire or anything around the beds to keep the chickens out. Well, needless to say, that was not successful. The chickens ended up getting in the compost and scratching. So that's something in my head. I thought, well, hey, if they don't eat the plants, right, then we'll be good to go. But that wasn't the case. They love to get in the onions and scratch around. And while they didn't eat the onions themselves, what they did was they would upset the onion bulbs, and we'd have to go back through and plant them. And inevitably, they had to have stunted the growth of the onions specifically. Another failure in regards to the chickens was what I wanted to do is plant beans in the areas that were open, right? So that we could just pick them and eat them, nothing for canning or anything, but just to have with, a side meal or something throughout the week. Well, anyway, they came up, they got about 10, 12 inches tall, and before they could set flowers, the chickens went through and just wrecked them. So anyway, at that point we learned, make sure that we protect all of our gardens from the chickens. The next mistake that I wanted to discuss is we did not work the soil as well as what we should have. In my mind, we got all of this organic compost, we filled it all up, so I didn't want to disturb the soil. I wanted to allow the microbes and those sorts of things the chance to break down undisturbed. Well, that was a mistake on my part. You need to break the soil up on the top, even if you don't flip it. And I guess that's the key, to make sure you get the aeration, give the water time to penetrate the soil, that sort of thing. And the way I found this out was at the end of the year when I went through and I was pulling up our sweet potatoes and I was pulling the plants out of the actual beds themselves. Some of that compost had formed into like very solid pieces where I had to take a hoe and put effort into breaking them apart. I do believe, though, that the drought and the extreme temperatures from last year played a role in that as well. But I mean, let's face it, when you're gardening, there's going to be challenges, and you need to make sure that you do the best you can to overcome the challenges. So through the course of this video series, you're not going to hear me do a lot of excuses from, like a drought standpoint or a heat standpoint. And the reason for that is I believe those are going to be challenges that we're going to have to face more and more often moving forward. For anybody who's a homesteader or a gardener, you're going to have to face challenges with the weather changing the way it is. And if we create good practices, and that's what I believe I'm going to do with the soil this year, breaking it apart and things, I believe that's going to be a best practice for us moving forward. Well, the final mistake I'd like to discuss today is the way that we orientated our cucumbers in relation to the garden. When I put these in there, we were like, oh, sweet, we got these big beds. We're going to put the cucumbers on the back side of the rows. That way we can plant in front of them, et cetera, et cetera. And that part of it worked, and it was relatively successful, minus the chickens destroying everything. But what it did do, though, is it created a sun barrier. So I'm looking at the camera, this is east. And when you go back over me, that is west. And so what ended up happening was, as the summer went along, it got worse and worse, the amount of shade that the cucumbers were putting on the beds lower than them. So that was a mistake that we definitely made. The cucumbers did fantastic. Even the ones behind the original cucumbers, they grew just fine. What it really impacted, though, was the eggplant. We hardly got any eggplant last year. Our yellow squash, the productivity wasn't near what it usually is. And I also believe that some of the reasons why our peppers that were in front of the cucumbers, while they succumbed to diseases and things, while the ones in the pallet garden didn't, I think was because they had lack of sun. Well, speaking of cucumbers, that brings us to our first win. We got so many cucumbers last year. We put up over 30 quarts of pickles. Leslie makes the best fermented pickles. We love them. 30 is a good number for us too, because we end up giving away so many of them throughout the course of the winter. With Christmas just passing, we probably gave away 10 quarts of them just around that time of the year. But anyway, we got a lot of them. We got a lot of pickling cucumbers. We got a lot of slicing cucumbers. That was one of the things that we were able to give away throughout the course of the year. So they did really well. We did end up having to deal with a lot of pests, a lot of squash bugs and things, and we put a lot of that here on the channel. But overall, the cucumbers were a resounding success. The second success that I wanted to mention for this year were the onions. I mentioned earlier that we got the onions in mid-February. They grew really well, probably because the compost was so hot, had all the extra nitrogen and such. So we were able to eat the greens, what we call the spring onions. We were able to start eating those in mid-March, right around the time that our radishes and lettuces started coming up. So it made for a fantastic early year salad. But the reason that I count them as a success is not only were we able to eat the green onions, and we did that all the way up through June, but whenever they started to flower right around the end of June, whenever the heat started to set in, we went through and pulled them, and we got a mass amount of onions. We were able to dry and cure them ourselves inside. We've eaten off them all through the fall and winter. We even got through the holiday season, and now we're in early January, and I'm down to just a little over a half dozen, I think, or so. But overall, I would consider that a very, very huge success, because we eat a lot of onions here on the homestead. So finally, I'd like to just discuss a few small things. The butternut squash that we grew over the trellis, it did relatively well. I'm not going to call it a success or a failure, to be honest. It was somewhere right in the middle. We got enough butternut squash to where we could eat it throughout the summer. We had a few cured for the winter time, but they're gone now. Going forward, that's something I'd like to have more of, but we'll talk about that in later videos. So what did we learn through the course of 2022? Well, we learned that I've got to get better at getting food out of the old garden. It's a lot of room. It's got great soil. It gets good sunshine in the summertime. And I think if we orient everything correctly, we can double or even triple the production that comes out of here. So from a homesteading perspective, with our ultimate goal being, to be able to be as sustainable as possible here, I've got to do better. There's just no way around it. I did plan better. A few of the things that I sort of took away from 2022, though, was learning how the sun, because it's almost a direct shot from east to west, and there's it's surrounded by trees, but as the summer goes, the sun moves more and more towards the north as it goes over. And so when I was looking at the garden in June or July of 2021, before I decided to build it, it looked like it got a whole bunch of sun throughout the course of it. So what did we learn? We learned, well, we got to wait until the summertime really to plant things. So this isn't going to be a spring or a fall bed. It's going to be predominantly a summer bed. Another thing that we learned is that we've got to water this garden a little bit better. especially in June and July. I gave it more credit for getting shaded, and I was wrong. Again, as I discussed earlier, the ground got really hard. So as we're going to go through the summer, I'm just going to take a pitchfork and just make sure that I sort of break the soil up as we go, make sure it's aerated. It gives us a chance to get water deeper into the soil. So with all of that being said, I was pleased with 2022, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to redeeming myself in 2023. As always, we appreciate everybody sticking it out here with us until the end. I hope everybody takes care of themselves. Peace.